Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to the National Defense College virtual webinar, India's National Security, a Decade Ahead. Session 3 is titled, India in Transformation. India has had a journey full of invasions and foreign rulers, but today, India is poised for a transformation. It will possibly only come from a stable environment, good infrastructure, lower corruption, and greater synergies from economic collaboration, both regionally and globally. Now, may I welcome the chair and the panelists for session 3. Mr. Samir Saran was supposed to be the chair of this session, but for some reasons he has not been able to join us. But the chair is now going to be Navdeep Suri. Navdeep Suri is a distinguished fellow and a director of the Center for Economic Diplomacy. He leads existing CNED programs in Morocco, Kigali, and Dhaka, and in creating new areas of focus in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Gulf. Mr. Suri has had a long 36-year career in the Indian Foreign Service. He served in India's diplomatic mission in Cairo, Damascus, Washington, Dar es Salaam, and London. He was India's Consul General in Johannesburg, High Commissioner to Australia, and Ambassador to Egypt and the UAE. He also headed West Africa and Public Diplomacy departments in India's Ministry of External Affairs. Mr. Suri has a master's degree in economics. He has written on India's public diplomacy and soft power, India's Africa policy, and the Indian IT outsourcing industry. He also has translated 3 classic Punjabi works into English: The Watchmaker, Ford Life Incomplete, and Kuni Vaishakhi. Mr. Suri's initiative to introduce social media in the Ministry of External Affairs and its diplomatic missions in 2010 was commended. His contributions to building stronger ties between India and UAE was recognized by the President of the UAE when he was conferred the country's highest civilian award, the Order of Zayed II. Also joining us today is Shri Harshvardhan Shringla, Foreign Secretary. He's going to be delivering a speech. Shri Harshvardhan Shringla is a member of the Indian Foreign Service. In the course of a diplomatic career spanning 36 years, he has held a variety of positions in New Delhi and abroad. He has served as an ambassador of India to the United States of America, Kingdom of England, and as the High Commissioner of India to Bangladesh. He has also served in France, UNESCO, USA, at the UN, Vietnam, Israel, and South Africa. Shri Harshvardhan was graduated from the St. Stephen's College in Delhi and has worked in the corporate and public sectors in India prior to joining the Indian Foreign Service. He has pursued courses and published papers on conflict prevention, economic diplomacy, the Indian diaspora, and India-Bangladesh relations. Mr. Harshvardhan assumed charge as the Foreign Secretary of India on 29th January 2020. Also joining us today is, as a panelist, is Dr. Rudra Chaudhary. Mr. Chaudhary is the director of Carnegie India. His primary research focuses on the diplomatic history of South Asia and contemporary issues. He is a PhD from King's College London, MA from University of Exeter, UK, and an arts graduate from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. He is the author of Forged in Crisis, India and the United States since 1947. His research has been published in various prestigious scholarly and policy-focused journals. He's an occasional commentator in the media. He's a senior lecturer at the Department of War Studies and India Institute of King's College London. Also joining me as a panelist today is Dr. Shamika Ravi. Dr. Shamika Ravi is a non-resident senior fellow of the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institute, Washington, D.C. She was the former director of research at Brookings, India, and led the development economics vertical, where focus is on financial inclusion, health, gender inequality, and urbanization. Dr. Ravi is a visiting professor of economics at the Indian School of Business, where she teaches courses in game theory and microfinance. She was a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. She's also affiliated with the Financial Access Initiative of New York University. Dr. Ravi publishes extensively in peer-reviewed journals and writes regularly opinion pieces in major newspapers. Her research work has been featured and cited by the BBC, Guardian, Financial Times, most national and regional newspapers and magazines in India. We were supposed to be joined by Dr. Ajay Bhushan Pandey, the Finance Secretary, as well, but for unforeseen reasons, he has not been able to join us. Now, may I, hand over the session to you, Mr. Suri, for taking it ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gandhi. And the topic, the theme for this session is India in Transformation. And I'm delighted that we have such a distinguished panel to cover the various facets of this transformation from the foreign policy to the domestic economic perspectives. But to be honest, 2020 is kind of a tough year to be talking about India and transformation, particularly if you have in mind that positive connotation of transformation that we would like to use. The impact of COVID-19 on the economy is well known. We are now beginning to see some of the secondary effects of the extended lockdown that we had to have. And I think it's going to take some time before these effects wear off and we are able to get back to the not just the high growth trajectory that we aspire to, but also to make up for the lost time. And to that extent, maybe 2020 will go down, at least in economic terms, as a bit of a lost year for the country. On the security side, we've had to face up to unexpected challenges, particularly from China in Ladakh. And of course, we've seen developments in other parts of our neighborhood, which continue to test the mettle of our diplomacy. At the domestic front, we see serious challenges to that spirit of cooperative federalism that we take so much pride in. Sitting here in Amritsar, where I am currently, one is bombarded with news reports of the farmers' agitations and indeed the political agitations against the farm bills. And there's kind of occasionally a talk of lack of consultation. We saw the arrests in Mumbai of a well-known media figure, and again, indications that there are new stresses emerging in the federal structure and the rules of the game between the center and the state, and perhaps some pushback from states like Punjab or Kerala or Maharashtra or others against the center. And that perhaps is not the kind of transformation that we were seeking. I worry that on the religious side, we see more polarization. We see some pungent slogans like Love Jihad, and the spirit of a secular fabric that diplomats like us took such pride in promoting is occasionally being questioned from the fringes. And the fringes will be fringes, and I think we should all take heart from the fact that there is a mainstream of India that remains intact. But the challenges are definitely there. And yet, in the same areas and in other areas, we see a lot of room for optimism. We see some serious efforts to bring this India in transformation story back to a more desirable track. And certainly, some of the same challenges that I've mentioned about also present opportunities to us. The fact that China is a threat on the borders, but also combined with the fact that it has so egregiously overplayed its hand in dealing with not just India, but with Australia and Hong Kong and Taiwan and Vietnam and others, and of course in the United States and Canada. means that it has become something of a pariah in a large section of the international community. And that has clearly presented opportunities to us, and it has given a new lease of life to some of our relationships. It's given a new momentum to others. I've had the privilege of serving in the United States and in Australia. And certainly the kind of speed with which the Quad is moving forward is something quite remarkable, and certainly reflects a much more nimble and sure-footed approach in our foreign policy than previously, and that's certainly a very desirable transformation. Even with the pandemic itself and the devastation that it has wrought upon large parts of our economy, we see India emerging as perhaps a global hub for manufacture of vaccines. As and when the situation with regards to a viable vaccine stabilizes, I think we'll be at the forefront of countries that are not able to provide the vaccine to our own population, but also to export it in substantial numbers. In fact, one of the interesting facets of this whole COVID pandemic has been the opportunities that it created for some fairly deft medical diplomacy for India. And we've been able to send medical supplies to a very large number of countries, even medical teams to some of those countries. We continue to see a major transformation happening in the digital and telecoms field. We crossed 2 billion UPI transactions a day. And that's something that would have been unthinkable a few years back. So I think the fact that today we have a kind of digital infrastructure in place, the fact that we were able to use the Aadhaar systems to roll out the assistance and benefits to some of the most vulnerable sections of the society impacted by the pandemic, reflects a transformation at the grassroots that is often not visible, certainly not to the critics of government, but also not sometimes visible to commentators. But a lot has happened because there's a digital backbone in place. We see this now manifesting itself in the edutech domain, where distance education is catching on. Again, that COVID-19 became an opportunity for some of our more nimble companies to really scale up. And I think we are the only country today that has unicorns in the education and edutech space. We see something similar emerging in health tech, and the kind of work that is happening on the use of data in India, in communities, in data for the use of governance, improved governance, and for development. I think some of these examples, both from government and from social entrepreneurship, as we go
We've had some internet issues from Amritsar, from where Mr. Suri was joining us. Why don't we move on? In the meanwhile, while he joins, why don't we listen to the statement by Shri Harshvardhan Shringla? He recorded it. So please go ahead and roll that statement out.
Air Marshal D. Chaudhary, Commandant National Defence College, Shri Samir Saran, President of ORF and Chairperson of this session, all alumni, faculty and students of the National Defence College, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by extending my heartiest congratulations to the National Defence College on its completing 60 years. This is indeed a momentous occasion and a proud moment for all participants, faculty members, as well as alumni of this illustrious institution. In the last 60 years, the National Defence College has truly emerged as a center of learning and experience. It has played a major role in shaping the minds of leaders of the armed forces as well as in the civil services. It is heartening to note that the alumni of this college have held very high-ranking positions in the armed forces and the civil services, not just in India, but in several countries all across the world. I am of the view that interlinkages between diplomacy, security, and strategic academia are fundamental to shaping our worldview and overall external engagements. Regular exchanges among all the above-mentioned key stakeholders are an important part of that exercise. The National Defence College provides a useful platform for these exchanges. The topic for today, leveraging strategic autonomy in a turbulent world, is an extremely important one in the present context. The concept of strategic autonomy is a function of the prevalent structure of the international order, making it a more relative concept as opposed to an absolute one. In today's multipolar world, all countries are, at some point or the other, susceptible to external pressure. The international global order, as we see it today, is a sum total of tectonic shifts. The two world wars, the Cold War phase, the post-Cold War era, the breakup of the erstwhile Soviet Union, the emergence of new countries in Eastern and Central Europe, the rise of Asian giants, Brexit, and other such watershed events have shaped the contours of the global order. As a result, the world around India has changed fundamentally in the last few years. It is also evident that the structural change that shaped the global order was predominantly as a result of the shift in the economic balance of power. In addition, new and emerging threats from terrorism, cyber security, climate change, and pandemics called for India to adjust its policies to the new realities. Our strategic autonomy thus necessitated the association between an autonomous foreign policy and security decision-making capability and the preservation of material assets, both technical and economic. In this changing environment, our focus has to be to further our national interests while also contributing to the global good. We have retained flexibility and decisional autonomy in pursuit of the first objective. We have deepened cooperation with our traditional partners. At the same time, we have widened our outreach and forged new partnerships. The second aspect of our global engagement has seen India emerge as a responsible and constructive actor on the world stage. India is an active participant in the global conversation on climate change, terrorism, connectivity, and maritime security. As a responsible global power, India co-founded institutions such as the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure to bring about greater cooperation in renewable energy and disaster preparedness and relief. In recent years, India's role in our extended neighborhood has been that of a net security provider. Net security does not have to be seen in the context of hard security. We have been at the forefront of extending humanitarian assistance in natural disasters such as earthquakes, cyclones, and floods, to name a few. We have launched rescue operations not just for our standard citizens, but for citizens of other friendly countries from all over the world. In the wake of the COVID crisis, our repatriation flights brought back not only our citizens, but also citizens of other countries. Net security also means cooperation with our neighbors in the Indo-Pacific region on maritime security, including anti-piracy, maritime surveillance, and responding to marine pollution, etc. We have developed a unique way of sharing our developmental experiences with partner countries. This has projected India's capacities and conveyed our strategic intention to be a force for good in multiple geographies across the globe. The COVID-19 pandemic is the most catastrophic event after the Second World War. It is therefore inevitable that we will experience a different world in the post-pandemic era. We are in the midst of trying to cope with the new reality of going virtual in our day-to-day life. At the international level, it has uncovered the vulnerabilities of nations and showed us the real manifestation of the practice of international relations. While there is a strong intent to cooperate, the need to retain strategic autonomy is even greater. The last few months thus have been an attempt to first deal with the domestic situation and second, look for ways to cooperate. We had a proactive domestic response in dealing with the pandemic and its challenges. We substantially expanded our capacity in the healthcare sector and also channeled our public resources to this critical sector for the development of hospitals, emergency rooms, provision of equipment and supplies, and training of healthcare professionals. In addition, our Prime Minister enunciated a forward-looking economic approach under the rubric of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, or self-reliance, with announcement of stimulus packages of nearly $270 billion. Structural reforms and relief measures under the Abhiyan cover small farmers, migrant workers and laborers, agriculture, the MSME sector, small businesses, startups, industrial infrastructure, healthcare and education, to name a few. In today's world, building at least some domestic capacities for critical supplies and contributing to a diversification of global supply chains is also a manifestation of leveraging strategic autonomy. India has played a leading role in initiating and encouraging global conversations on evolving a coordinated response to the pandemic. Further, living up to the teaching of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole world is one family, India played an instrumental role in enhancing global health security by ensuring supply of essential medicines, even while meeting its own domestic requirements. We provided medical supplies in the form of essential drugs, test kits, protective gear, etc. to over 150 countries and are extending medical assistance under grants and aid to over 80 countries. We sent rapid response medical teams to help the Maldives, Kuwait, Mauritius, and Comoros deal with the pandemic, and we dispatched naval assets to deliver COVID-related assistance to the Maldives, Mauritius, Madagascar, Comoros, and Seychelles. We have also successfully brought back over 1.8 million of our citizens stranded abroad due to the COVID-19 pandemic under the Vande Bharat mission. The global economic fallout of the pandemic will continue to remain a challenge for us in time to come. As we saw during the 2008 economic recession, the setbacks of this magnitude require a carefully deliberate approach. The breakdown of global supply chains has, perhaps for the first time, led us to think and explore alternative possibilities. India's view has been to look at this challenge not as a constraint but as an opportunity for our economy as well as for rebalancing the international system. In this situation of crisis, India has sustained the momentum with respect to its global engagements. We have recognized our strengths to work towards deepening our economic cooperation while keeping our strategic autonomy intact. We recognize the value of profitable economic convergence and the need to diversify as the need of the hour. A positive reflection of this approach was evident during the recently concluded virtual summits held at the Prime Minister's level with Australia, Denmark, the European Union, and Sri Lanka. Further, the second Australia, India, Japan, United States consultations on regional and global issues of common interest brought like-minded countries together to coordinate responses to the various challenges that the pandemic has brought to the fore. This is only a small part of India's outreach efforts. We have extensively used the virtual mode to sustain communications with our friends and partners. India assumes membership of the UN Security Council next year. We remain committed to upholding a rules-based international order underpinned by the rule of law, transparency, freedom of navigation in the international seas, respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, and peaceful resolution of disputes. Our objective remains advancing the security and economic interests of all countries. The UN Security Council dynamics have changed considerably over the last decade. As a rule-abiding democracy and positive contributor to the security of global commons, India aims to bring innovative and inclusive solutions to foster development. Reformed multilateralism is going to be a top priority for us. India has been a supporter of a fair and inclusive WTO, World Bank, IMF, and a significant player in the digital taxation negotiations. While there is a new plurilateral space that has opened up for engagement, it is clear that we need to carefully analyze our approach, keeping in mind the merits and values of strong bilateral engagements. I would like to once again thank the National Defence College for giving me this opportunity to participate in the Diamond Jubilee seminar. I convey my very best wishes once again to all the participants and alumni of the college for a very bright future. I am sure that under the leadership of the Commandant, Air Marshal D. Chaudhary, the college will continue to flourish and attain new heights. Thank you and namaste.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. And we now move on to the next segment. And it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Rudra Chaudhary, Director of the Carnegie Center, to speak on outreach and alliances for regional stability. Rudra, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Commandant, National Defence College, Honorable Foreign Secretary, Dr. Shamika Ravi, Mr. Chairperson, Ambassador Navdeep Suri, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to have been asked to speak to you today as a part of the NDC's Diamond Jubilee celebrations. As someone who has taught both at the Joint Services Command and Staff College in Shrivenham and also the Royal College of Defence Studies or RCDS, this is indeed a true honor. I've been asked today to speak on outreach or alliances for regional stability. The question has many different dimensions, and I must admit that I have struggled to come up with a coherent argument to frame the next 20 minutes. The title given to me essentially pushes one to think of A, what is the world in which we live in? What exactly is the geopolitical ecosystem in operation at this time? B, in these changing times, what is or what ought to be India's relationship with nations or a group of nations for a stronger partnership, an alignment, or even a bespoke coalition? And C, how can such alignments be struck whilst maintaining the freedom of diplomatic maneuver in the region and beyond? In sum, how do you get the balance right between the material and ideational need for strategic autonomy and the realities of a world truly in disarray? The first point is about context, what defines the world in which we live. The second is about the intent, what can or should India do? The third is about process, how can you do it? I'm a historian, I'm not a practitioner. Hence, I'm only going to limit my remarks to the first two, context and intent, and only lightly touch upon the question of process. I would also like to caveat my remarks by citing Henry Kissinger. There are two particular pieces of writing that appeal to me. A, the analyst can choose which problem he wishes to study, whereas the statesman's problems are imposed on him. B, the statesman is only permitted one guess, and the statesman must act on assessments that cannot be proved at the time that he is making them. In short, the aim of my remarks is not to double guess policy imperatives. I'm deeply cognizant of the disease of armchair analysis, which is why what I present today are reflections from the perspective of a historian who occasionally has the privilege of working in public policy. So to start with, in context, it would be an understatement to say that the world of today is dramatically different to the one in which the 21st century was born into. The wheels have completely come off the Sino-American relationship for the first time since 1989. The United States has retreated into a form of business-driven isolationism, which will be difficult to recover from no matter who occupies the White House in the coming days. There was a familiar line that defined the universe of international relations, roughly between 1945 and 2016. This line, as zigzag as it might have been, provided a degree of familiarity to the norms and rules of the game, as it were. This was essentially the Bretton Woods line that marked the creation of multilateralism as one knew it. It was a thick geopolitical line defining what India could often do to hedge against it, assimilate with it, or at times protect itself from. There is little doubt that we have collectively entered into another phase of international politics. The pandemic has only accentuated the speed with which the Bretton Woods-inspired structures stand challenged, yet and importantly remain in force. To top it all off, China's particularly emphatic political and military positions, whether on land or in the commons, is as naked today as it has ever been. The tragic incidents along the LAC in June of this year and the ongoing military and diplomatic struggle to find common meaning in a climb down could well be explained away as a result of such assertion. Yet, in my view, it would be foolhardy to overplay the so-called wolf warrior syndrome that has apparently inflicted Xi China into confrontation along almost every axis of international politics. If anything, the loud and often unendurable wolf warriors of Chinese diplomacy is perhaps only a symptom of a change that China itself is beginning to fully understand. There is considerable time to focus on what shapes this change, what led to the dreadful incidents in June, and what Xi China is, to put it simply, up to. Decoding Xi China is important, no doubt, but this is not a task that will in itself lead to clarity. It's worth keeping in mind that scholars are still divided about what actually led to the outbreak of war in 1962. Was it the failure of civil-military relations? Was it the poor planning on the part of the Indian Army? Was it really Krishna Menon or Nehru's misreading of a China reeling from the Great Leap Forward? As analysts, we can only work off outcomes. The fact remains that the Sino-Indian relationship has and must be redefined. A new equilibrium has to be sought to limit our economic dependence on China, which is exactly what the government of the day is doing at this time. The architecture of this relationship, defined by milestone visits and agreements between 1988 and roughly 2013, that I believe both bought us time and also allowed the relationship to move well beyond disagreement, will now need a new force of logic. Till then, we can expect a lot more kinetic activity along the LAC and more examples of escalation and longer time periods of multiple arguments about the right pathway for de-escalation. For what we must accept in this new design for this relationship is that both political and military deterrence has failed. Equally, we will need to find a way to re-engage China only once the PLA has returned a status quo that is militarily and politically acceptable to India. So what can and should India do to mitigate the deep strategic risks to its growth and prosperity in these fast-changing times? And this takes me to the second part of my talk, which is on intent. India is a country that has always believed in the exceptionalism of its own imperatives. Whether it was negotiating the Green Revolution or the nuclear deal with the United States, what is clear is that India finds ways to design its own path. This is what strategic autonomy allows you to do. But the key question is, how far can the real and conceptual characteristics of autonomy be stretched to accommodate the needs for material growth, coalesce with others to dissuade aggression, and also stabilize the region around principles of both military and diplomatic deterrence? For the fact is, China is no longer the elephant in the room. It is squarely the center of debate, and it ought to be so. Further, there is little doubt that Imran Khan's Pakistan is a nation driven by an impulse that is at odds with the prospects for dialogue. The growth of the Sino-Pakistani relationship, which began in earnest in March 1963, when both countries signed a land boundary agreement over Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, is currently the most stable axis for Pakistan's military and civilian leaders. And this is unusual. Between 1963 and roughly 2014, in one way or the other, Pakistani leaders from Ayub to Yahya and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto to Zardari was given space to make the best of relations with both the US and China. This has changed. There is little appetite in the United States, whether it's Biden or Trump, to accommodate Pakistani interests, apart from the narrow need to withdraw from Afghanistan with a face-saving deal. Yet, and given the strengthening Sino-Pakistani alliance, the prospects of a two-front military confrontation, if not even war, is not an abstract possibility, but one that demands a multi-tiered response, and not only one designed around the capabilities and reach of our military. In this period of change, broken multilateralism, outsized Chinese nationalism, and a violently energized Pakistan, the path to stability can perhaps be achieved along 6 broad sets of alignments. These 6 alignments will need to work in tandem. To use a term from the world of technology, consider this India's intertwined foreign policy stack. If one layer ceases to function, the stack itself turns less efficient or at worst unresponsive. 1. Further deepening the military relationship with the United States. Both countries have come a very long way since Prime Minister Vajpayee spoke of natural allies. But to define an international order, and apart from deeply invested defense ties, there will be a need for India and the United States to work together on common objectives internationally in the effort to restore and revise the contours of multilateralism. This has not happened in the last 4 years. This may not be possible if President Trump returns, but it will be crucial if Biden wins the elections. 2, further defining the Quad, which is now, according to me and as I see it, a marketplace for security. There is a need to institutionalize Quad and engineer a degree of institutional resilience that can buck the current trend of everyday politics and the natural change of political actors leading these 4 nations. Further, apart from maritime cooperation, it ought to become a standard-setting partnership. Here, India has an advantage. As Ambassador Suri mentioned in his opening remarks, India is a leading technology market, whether it's in digital payments, future discussions around central bank issued digital currencies, or questions around data access and transfers. There is an opportunity to use the Quad and leverage Indian interests in these domains. For instance, there is no reason why the unified payments infrastructure, which powers Google Pay and WhatsApp Pay and a number of other digital payment infrastructures, should not be exported well beyond India's borders. Certainly, this is a key way in which India can build a different and forward-looking relationship within the Quad, but also through the G20 and in South Asia. As far as South Asia is concerned, which brings me to point number 3, the question we should be asking ourselves every day is why Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, the Maldives and India are not in fact on the same page as far as the future of data and technology is concerned. There is without doubt an unsettled electricity that runs through the veins of the citizenry from Nepal to Bhutan and from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. There is no point in avoiding these questions and impulses. Each of these states, apart from Bhutan, have embraced Chinese investments and advances. We cannot afford to, or nor should we, go eye to eye with China. It will turn into an economic arms race that we can neither win nor afford at India's present stage of development and priorities. But we can find new ways to redefine relations via technological alignments, common data frameworks, and even a streamlined payments investiture. We often talk about the health stack, agri stack, and India stack. Let's start talking about a South Asia stack. It allows us to provide something new to South Asia and export our own very rich digital infrastructures. 4, deepening ties with the EU as its member states wake up to the challenge of China. Although many EU states embrace BRI, there is an awakening in the EU that it ought to provide alternatives for India. Here again, tech and investment is key. Our startup economy is doing its bit to redefine this relationship. Today, Oyo and Ola are household names in Europe. Tata and Wipro have been so for many decades. However, alignment with the EU is and will be difficult for one simple reason. The EU, or the European Commission, the administrative system through which the EU deals with the world, can hardly speak in one voice. As we work with the EU on the future of supply chains or biotechnology, and also look to foster ties in counterterrorism and security, it is the vision with European friends like France, industrial hubs like Germany, technological hospices like Estonia, and then with the UK, where we will need to, and we are, finding common ground and meaning as far as the Indo-Pacific and other factors of structure are concerned. Number 5, as I mentioned earlier, we will need to think through the realignment with China. Once the current crisis de-escalates, and notwithstanding the fact that we have squarely moved into another phase of our relations with China, we also need to work with China in the near future. In this, we cannot rely on a static American or Australian position with regards to China. I don't see this flipping away from a form of containment at operation today, but we have to mitigate for changes in domestic political pathways in these states and then design our own path. As I have mentioned earlier, there was a familiar line that dotted the Sino-Indian relationship between roughly 1988 and 2013. The logic underlying this line stabilized the relationship across a 3,488-kilometer frontier and at the same time allowed trade to commence, albeit and unexpectedly to China's favor. India will need to judiciously think through the contours that define the fourth phase in our relationship with China. The first three, one could say, was between 49 and 88, 88 and 2002, and then 2002 and 2020. In the fourth, we will need to construct a balance, allowing just enough space for favorable economic relations, whilst designing a strategy of comprehensive deterrence to dissuade adventurism on and along the LAC. This will require the entire foreign policy stack to come into sharper focus. And lastly, and number 6, not forgetting Russia, a worryingly close ally of China. It's worth recounting that it was in 1989 that Russia and China found common meaning for the first time since the early 60s. And that brought them closer together. We're in a similar kind of position today. American friends of mine, as I'm sure of many of yours, would argue that there is something inherently contradictory between strengthening ties with both the United States and Russia. But as Dr. Jaishankar has eloquently penned in his latest treatise on Indian foreign policy, managing contradictions is what foreign policy is all about. And this is something that India does well. However, and to conclude, hedging, managing contradictions, and defining international frontiers all depend on India's ability to economically recover from what is a compounded crisis. Accounting for the slowdown in the Indian economy prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, and then dealing with the devastating effects of COVID-19. It's worth keeping in mind that India deployed many fiscal and monetary mechanisms to arrest the slowing economy, perhaps leaving it with limited room at present. But this is key. Regional stability by way of alignments and outreach can only be expected or even driven if India remains, and as importantly, is seen to remain economically buoyant. Further, our efforts at military modernization are directly dependent upon our ability to finance capital expenditures. No alignment can replace or substitute the generation of domestic economic might. They can only aid this process. Let me end with perhaps a challenging note. We can only achieve an international vision and best assure regional stability and see it realized if the seesaw between protectionism and liberalization is tilted in the favor of the latter. The force of and for Atmanirbhar Bharat is crucial, and I for one believe in its design, but we must keep all pathways for growth open as we invest in ourselves and for our self-sufficient future. And we are not doing this to keep our partners content, but we're doing this and need to do it for ourselves, to keep growing and to develop the 21st century from a genuine position of enduring strength. As this audience well knows, at its minimum, strategy is about the relationship between ends, ways, and means. We may have an end in mind, but this chain of logic and practice can only be effective if it is to be tailored to the means in our economic and political arsenals. Lastly, on an altogether separate note, and particularly for this audience, may I please take the opportunity to underline the crucial importance of further investing in professional military education. The NDC, designed around what is today the RCDS, is an oasis in the expansion of military thought, the engineering of multi-state partnerships, expanding the minds and visions of our military and select civilian leaders, and our friends from across the world. It is our duty, if I may suggest, to expand upon the wonderful lineage of this organization, started in 1960, to evolve a PME system that permeates every aspect of military education with the right balance of opinions and expertise. Military education can go much further in India, for if we are to realize stability, as mentioned earlier, we can only do so really if our minds remain lucid and open to ideas, facts, competing histories, and visions for the future that can only evolve as and when we allow it to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rudra Chaudhary, for some really thought-provoking comments and suggestions. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of discussion around them, but the program tells me that we now have a 20-minute tea break, and perhaps we can take that break and reconvene in about 20 minutes to continue this discussion, because our next speaker Dr. Shamika Ravi will also have some fascinating insights. Welcome back to everyone, and we're going to resume this session post the tea break. Our next speaker on this panel is the very distinguished Dr. Shamika Ravi of the Brookings Institution, somebody whose comments and writings I follow with a great deal of interest, and who's been particularly illuminating in her analysis of the pandemic. And Dr. Shamika, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Suri. Namaskar, everyone. And first of all, congratulations to the National Defense College and the extended network of students and alumni on completion of 60 successful years. I wish you many more years of success and growth. Today, the topic given to me is, of course, India in transformation, but reigniting growth within the Indian economy. I'd like to, first of all, familiarize you with what the basic fundamental structure of the Indian economy is. There are certain myths, there are certain aspects of the fundamental structure of the Indian economy, which lends itself to, peculiarity, which requires specific solutions. And familiarity with this is very important to really appreciate the direction towards we are moving. So I have put together a series of pictures, namely statistics, for you to take a look at. If we can go to the second slide, please. So this has been India's growth. While most of you are familiar with the fact that India has seen unprecedented economic growth over the last 25 years, it's very important to understand that on a per capita basis, seeing this kind of a phenomenal growth for such a large population country in the world is in itself quite a remarkable achievement. And outside of China, India remains the country which has pulled millions, hundreds of millions of people outside poverty. So this phenomenon of exponential growth that we have seen in the last 25 years is indeed a big achievement for India. Can we go to the next, please? Now, this was meant to be a dynamic graph. What you have here is a frozen one. But let me tell you, the reason for putting this statistics here was to show that growth is a real phenomenon. Growth is something that happens over one generation, perhaps a couple of generations. So it's a very real, it's not an abstract theoretical concept. And it's important to recognize that an average Korean, an average Chinese, and an average Indian had the same level of per capita income merely 45 years back. So all it has taken is 45 years for South Korea to today become 10 times as rich on a per capita basis than India, and for China to become 4 times as rich compared to India. In fact, the Chinese growth, economic growth, is really a last 20 years phenomenon. Of course, the foundation was laid beforehand, and I'm going to also talk about India's some of the structural transformations that have led to this growth. But the Chinese pulling away from the Indian situation is really a very recent phenomenon. In fact, India had higher per capita income as far behind as 25 years. So there is a remarkable insight when you consider what a short period of time countries transform themselves and why growth needs to become one of our overarching agenda for any government, not just at the center, but also at the state level. Next, please. This is showing the Human Development Index because life, of course, for economists, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on economic indicators such as GDP. But if you look at human development indicators, which includes health, education, it includes gender. And when you look at these quality of life indices in a composite way, which is what the HDI is, then you realize that India is 10 years behind China as far as improvements in HDI is concerned. And we are well on our way to becoming a high HDI country in the next 7 years. So the growth path is quite consistent with China, despite the fact that economic growth in China has been remarkably high for a very long period of time, much longer than we have. Next, please. Now, a country in transformation is, of course, beyond economic indicators like the GDP per capita that I spoke about. But you also have real life indicators, and this is a very important one which I like to share with people, particularly folks who are getting despondent and worry about the country becoming intolerant or particularly divided. This is a measurement of NCRB data's measure of rioting. And riot is an event which includes more than 5 individuals in a violent episode. And you will notice that India used to have a lot more riots. In fact, the number of riots in India have steadily fallen since economic progress began in early 90s. And this is a consistent path if you consider the last 10 years as well, which seems to suggest that, if you look at multiple different indicators of how society is in transformation, we are a much more peaceful society if measured in terms of events such as rioting. India used to see a lot of rioting. In fact, many districts across the country had very regular, frequent rioting, and those have obviously come down. But of course, we live in an age of hyper connectivity and in the age of WhatsApp and social media, where isolated events, where anecdotal, a couple of events can be blown up, and there is a certain asymmetry in the responses that we elicit. And so this is an objective measure of what is happening, at least as far as rioting is concerned in the country. India is today more peaceful than it was 30 years back. Next, please. This is a measure to really show basic statistics on something that the Foreign Secretary spoke about, what Ambassador Suri also mentioned in his opening remarks. India is far more connected today, and connection, if measured in terms of people having Aadhaar, which is a unique digital ID, having financial access as measured in terms of a bank account, and having mobile connectivity. The reason these three get clubbed together is because, and this is what the Prime Minister speaks about, and many of us have been writing now for over decades, is the JAM Trinity and the promise of having an architecture which includes an ID, a digital ID, a bank account, and mobile connectivity. It really functions as a digital platform with the backing of bank account and mobile connectivity, which allows for many market solutions to a lot of our problems, services and goods. But at the same time, it also allows for the state to function more efficiently, and the entire apparatus of subsidy or a welfare state that India is, it helps move the structure towards a more efficient, more transparent welfare architecture. What you will notice in this graph is almost every state of the country is reporting more than 90% households having Aadhaar, bank account, and mobile. And that is a remarkable achievement for a country at the per capita level income that India has, which is about $2,200 per year. And another remarkable thing about this rising connectivity is the fact that while Aadhaar and bank accounts have been extended, or the outreach has been improved on the back of government efforts, mobile connectivity has largely penetrated very remote areas of the country on account of private enterprise. And this is very important to acknowledge that a very large part of India's growth, while the foundations and the rules, the policies are enacted at the government levels, but it has truly been on the back of a tremendous private enterprise that India has seen the kind of remarkable economic growth over the last 25 years. Telecom certainly is one of those sectors, which is very fundamental. Next, please. Now, this graph is basically showing the concentration of poverty. And it's very important to really understand that poverty, and of course, this was also meant to be a dynamic graph, but it's frozen here. Apologies for that. I really hope we are able to share this slide with the wider population or the audience. is that India has concentration of poverty towards the eastern part. And there is a concentration of wealth, which is towards the western part of the country. So unlike the common belief that India has a north-south divide, which is what the common media conversation tends to pick up, a lot of the politics and the writings around it tend to pick up, but in terms of economic progress, India truly has an east-west divide. In fact, we could draw a line from Srinagar to Kanyakumari, and to the west of that line, you have the largest concentration of wealth in the country, and the east of that is where our efforts towards eradicating poverty, a lot of our development efforts are focused. So that divide is very important for us to understand when we think of government policies and why they need to be tailor-made to those conditions. Next, please. India also has an urban-rural divide, something that we have often talked about. But it's important to understand, here you're only seeing poverty. If you saw wealth, you would see that wealth is largely concentrated in urban centers of India, which means our cities truly are the engines of growth. A very large part of India resides in the rural areas. And of course, if we go back to the census of more than 11 years back, the general understanding, the general conversation is around India being overwhelmingly a rural country, and that's not true. India today is far more urban. In fact, it is close to 65% urban. And it is on account of either luminosity data, looking at concentration of households, looking at new measures. And the last 11 years have also seen remarkable growth in urbanization. Now, a lot of urbanization and migration is really from the villages to the nearest township within the district. So what you're noticing on TV sets or what you hear about, read about, are people migrating from the poorer eastern states to the more industrial belt, which are the western part of the country. But maximum migration is really within the district, from the villages to the rural areas. And that's because at every district level, we are seeing a very fast pace, not always very well structured, and that is a problem, urbanization. So urban growth is a great opportunity for wealth creation and development in the country. It is also a cause of great policy urgency because we are managing cities through state governments, and cities truly, global experience has shown that cities deserve their own governance models. And this is the 74th constitutional amendment, which was brought in and which is yet to be, adapted and implemented in its truest form. So we still have not started to put the kind of effort we need to in terms of urbanization. Next, please. Now, what this graph is meant to show is the infant mortality rate. India has seen phenomenal growth, and with economic growth, what you see in India is that across all categories of states, the southern states, the poorest, the most backward parts of the country, as well as the rest of every state has seen very rapid improvements in some basic fundamental indicators of development, such as infant mortality. So there's been a big decline in infant mortality everywhere with economic growth. We have also seen improvements in maternal mortality throughout the country. And these are real big achievements, which is not just economic growth, but economic growth translating into improvement in terms of quality of life across the country. Next, please. But India is a very large economy. In fact, India should be thought of as a country which has 28 state economies, vibrant, very diverse state economies. This is where individual states started out. You are seeing that in terms of the base year 2000, Goa and Delhi, in fact, are almost 10 times as rich as an average person in Bihar. So average Goan and a Delhiite is almost 10 times richer than an average Bihari. Punjab was one of our richest states because Goa and Delhi were not states a long time back. Punjab was the breadbasket very similar to Haryana, Punjab, Haryana, two of our richest states. But this is where we started out, and I want you to look at this. And can we go to the next slide, please? But this is where we ended up, which is that Goa and Delhi remain very fast growing. But what is happening to Punjab? Look at Haryana and look at Punjab. These are the per capita incomes. Haryana today is almost twice as rich. An average Haryanvi is almost twice as rich as an average Punjabi. States are growing very differently. The models or the comparative advantages of distinct of states are very different. We talk about India as a big economy, but we are really glossing over what are dynamic 28 very different set of economies. What it also tells you is that there are definitely breakout states. While at an all India level, we are seeing rapid economic growth in 25 years, states like Gujarat, Sikkim, Uttarakhand, what you have missing here is Telangana. These are states that have truly raced ahead and bucked the trend. So they have become very, very fast growing, and they have become a lot richer than an average Indian. What is important here is an economy such as Punjab are not keeping pace. And that is where the talk about the Farm Bill becomes very important. That when you have an economy which is fundamentally growing on the back of agriculture, what are the kind of policy transformations that are required? How does the society transform from being traditional agriculture economy towards either a modern high-tech agriculture economy, like let's say Israel, Switzerland, etc.? Or do you actively move people out by diversifying the economy into, let's say, manufacturing and services? Punjab has lost a lot of its manufacturing plants to the neighboring states of Himachal, Rajasthan, Haryana, etc. So we have to understand that the great deviations or the variations we have across states of India hide a lot when we think of all India statistics, which can be a bit simplistic. Also important to note, Bihar has seen growth, but Bihar today remains almost 30 years behind Delhi and Goa. And that in itself is a cause of concern, that when you have country where different parts are growing at such different pace, how do we keep everyone together? Because you are unified in the fiscal sense. We do want a basic common minimum quality of life, which is where a lot of our welfare policies come in, whether it is NREGA, whether it is the PDS, the whole measure of poverty line. We like to have uniformity in terms of what is a basic minimum affordable quality of life for an average Indian, while at the same time different states are moving at quite clearly very different rates of economic growth. Next, please. Now, this is meant to tell you that the labor markets across the country are also very fragmented. Labor is a state subject. We have high unemployment in some of our most highly developed states. At the same time, while all India level unemployment is around 6%, we have states such as Karnataka and Gujarat, which are fast growing from the economic sense. They have very low unemployment rates, like 1.5% to 0.9% in Gujarat. What it tells you is that wealth creation is leading to job creation in the country. Because you have states like Kerala and Tripura, which have a multiple of the national level unemployment rate, which seems to suggest that economic growth does bring jobs. And states which have done well from a welfare perspective, from a development perspective, also need to grow economically to really create jobs for the citizens in those states. A peculiarity of India's labor market, because employment jobs is very important for young countries such as ours. It is always a political hot wire for every election, and it is important, and it ought to be for a young country and a populous one like us. But it's important to recognize that structurally there are some peculiarities that we grapple with. India has a peculiarly low labor force participation rate, which is about 50%. Labor force participation is people of the working age are either working or they are looking for work. And a 50% labor force participation rate means, half the population of working age are neither looking for work nor working. So the question is, where are they and what are they doing? Now, gender is a large part of that story, but it's not the whole story. because a country like Bangladesh has 57% labor force participation rate. Vietnam has close to 74% labor force participation rate. China has had over 75% labor force participation for over 30 years now. So it's important to understand some of the structural underpinnings of what India's economy looks like, and labor is very much an important component of that structure. Next, please. Now, this is a global phenomenon, youth inactivity, that people in the age group of 18 to 29, so before the age of 30, people tend to be much more unemployed than when after 30 years of age. Now, there could be sociological reasons for this because this is a global phenomenon, but in India, this is particularly exaggerated. Our youth is particularly inactive economically. But once again, what this tells you is that in states which are growing economically, again, Gujarat, Karnataka, Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, Telangana, Madhya Pradesh, etc., these are states where also the youth unemployment is lower, which means where you have wealth creation, you have job creation for every category of age group, including the youth. And it's states where we are not seeing much economic growth or wealth creation is where we have very high youth inactivity. And high youth inactivity leads to all kinds of complications and sociological problems, problems of security, and problems which the state has to grapple with and the society has to grapple with. Next. Here is another peculiarity of our economy. A little bit like the Chinese, we have a problem which I called graduate unemployment. Amongst the youth who have a graduate degree and above, they are 5 times as likely to be unemployed than youth in the same category who have primary education and below, which means the highly educated youth in India is much, much more likely to be unemployed today than its relatively uneducated youth. This lends itself to the basic fundamental problem with what we consider the wedge between educational degrees in our country and the skill set that the market values. That the market is not valuing the degrees that our colleges and universities are handing out as much. So there is that gap. Second, of course, is the quality of the education itself. That a lot of skilling that we are trying to do through many of our skill development programs is really making up for poor quality school education. Because a lot of skills, professional skills, is about professional, about disciplining, habit formation, being punctual, cleanliness, basic hygiene, timeliness. So many aspects of skill development that India is grappling with is fundamentally, it has to do with the quality of education and the poor quality of education in the school system, which is why the new education policy, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The second point is also the expectations in the youth has to be managed better. Because once you have a degree, the expectation is that you're going to get, or you're waiting for a job that frankly is not going to come. That is what this phenomenon tells us. That expectations of the youth has to be better managed in economies like India, China, where you have a lot of youth, highly educated, not economically productive or active. Next. But fundamentally, this is what it is about. It's about poverty reduction. Growth does lead to hundreds of thousands of people, even now, with an absolute poverty of 5%. With growth, we do pull people out of poverty. And India has seen one of the fastest reduction in poverty historically anywhere in the world, other than China. In fact, today we have a lot fewer in terms of headcount, number of poor than smaller countries like Congo and Nigeria compared to our size. So growth is very important, and why we need to stay the course. Because eventually it is about it's about improving people's quality of life and taking care of some of the poorest in the society. Next. Very briefly, because we are in the midst of a pandemic, India has seen one of the fastest or one of the biggest decline in terms of GDP on account of COVID amongst these major economies. So we have seen a big decline. But what is truly a puzzle is that this decline has happened on the back of what is one of the lowest death rates in the world. So there is a great degree of panic in India on account of COVID. And the lockdowns, of course, have been quite severe, and an extended lockdown has meant that our economic growth decline has been pretty large. This graph is meant to tell you that there are countries such as Spain, UK, Italy, which have had big economic decline, but they have also had many, many deaths. There are countries like South Korea, Indonesia, Finland, which have had low economic decline and low deaths. But there are economies like Philippines and India, where we've had very few deaths, but our economic decline has been very large. And that needs to now be addressed. Next. And in many ways, in the last 45 days, we have seen that the number of cases per capita and the number of the daily deaths, they have both been steadily declined. So India indeed has peaked as far as the COVID infections are concerned, at least the first peak. Most countries are seeing multiple. There's no obvious reason to believe we will not have. But indeed, we have peaked, and over the last 4 or 5 weeks, we have seen a steady decline, which is lending itself to now an economic pickup, which is much faster. Next. Next. Yeah. This is telling you across states of India. When we imposed a lockdown, again, a global policy response, you've had a big decline in economic activity as measured by, this is Google mobility, so high frequency data, which is quite insightful. Big decline, almost 85% decline in economic activity. And since then, you're seeing the states are picking up. Of course, states like Maharashtra, Kerala, Telangana, states where you've had the largest increase and the case count in terms of the infection. Those are the states where the pickup is slowest as compared to an all India. But even these states, if you compare them to May, they're all seeing a pickup. So India is on its path to economic recovery. We are still about 29% under compared to pre-COVID. But of course, this is retail and recreation, so it's one specific sector. This is not all India. But the pickup is definitely robust, and though it varies across the different states, but the infections are a good explanation for why some states are picking up very fast, while the others aren't. Next. This is my final slide, and this is where I'm trying to explain the fact that in the last 6 months, what the government has clearly done is treated it as a window of opportunity to bring in certain long-term pending structural economic reforms that India needs, the Indian economy needs, and agriculture is one of them. Because in the 91 reforms or the early 2000 reforms, many sectors underwent transformation through policy reforms, but not agriculture. Agriculture has been quote-unquote holy cow for 3 decades now, and it's only now that we are opening the sector to modern technology adaptation, modern innovation, the need to bring in more entrepreneurship, and the need to move beyond certain basic food grains items. And if you look at states such as Bihar, where APMCs were dismantled a long time back, you are seeing that those states have seen greater variation in prices, but they have also seen more diversification. These are states where the agriculture is growing fast and also growing in ways which is healthy from a long-term perspective. Labor market reforms we have seen in the last 6 months. Several states are now free to implement their own set of more variable labor codes. And that is a welcome step, because for a very long time, labor has been extremely problematic in terms of particularly the agriculture, particularly manufacturing sector in India. We finally adopted property cards, which are property documents. It's important to have well-defined and protected property rights for economic transactions. And so this is, and it has gone, fairly discussed. We have not discussed this very important reform. We haven't discussed it much in the media, but we should. because it is something which has been pending for a long time. And the fact that people now have their property documents and land documents really does lend itself to much more efficient transactions and much more transparent transactions. The new education policy has been a huge improvement, again, because for a large demographic, which is within an age group which is not productive enough from a global perspective. We have known from the ASR reports, fifth graders not being able to write their names or do basic counting has required that the new education policy requires us to improve our quality of education, not just at the school level, but also all the way to the tertiary or the college levels. And now the new education policy allows for this kind of experimentation and new solutions at the higher ed spectrum as well. So it's a very welcome step. Ayushman Bharat is a move that India has made towards universal health coverage. So that's a very welcome step. Of course, it's only bottom 40% of the population. The idea is to defragment the market because we have government employees that have the very wide coverage, such as the CGHS, which has an extremely remarkably good coverage for healthcare, while we have the Ayushman Bharat, which is for the bottom 2 quintiles. This kind of defragmenting of the market is required so that all government health insurance comes under sort of one big umbrella, so that the diseconomies are taken care of. But eventually, these are all steps which are towards realizing what is India's true growth potential. And hopefully, we can be back onto track of an exponential growth, which is very much required for a country which is still around $2,200 per year per capita. So a long way to go, but these are all the right steps. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Shamika, for that really insightful presentation on India's socioeconomic transformation and the many facets that you brought out. In fact, I thought that two that we might have missed. One, something that each time I travel down the Delhi-Amritsar highway, I notice is the improvement in infrastructure. And, across the country, the transformation in highways has really been quite spectacular. And the same is true as you travel around to the airports. And now that I think belatedly is coming down to the railways and the railway stations and the ports and to the larger logistics chain, whether it is warehousing or it is cold chains or container trains or whatever. Some of those bottlenecks that have tended to inhibit India's growth, I think, are finally being addressed. And I see them as becoming an important part of the Indian transformation story. The other one, I think, which we missed out on perhaps is renewable energy, where we are crossing 90 gigawatts of combined renewable energy output, not just commissioned capacity for wind and solar. I think the last numbers that I saw were something like 38 or 39 gigawatts from wind and another 37, 38 from solar, and solar growing more rapidly than wind over the last few years. Who would have thought that we would be actually ahead of the curve in terms of our Paris commitments for renewables? So I think there are many other facets of the Indian transformation story that we could look at. But let me use the chairman's prerogative and set off the Q&A session, perhaps with a little comment and a question to Shamika. You mentioned the Punjab Haryana story, and without wanting to seem too parochial, because of my current geographical location, I should just say that Haryana does get an outsized bounce in its growth because of proximity to Delhi. And I wonder if you took Gurgaon and the NCR, National Capital Region economy out of the equation, then what you're left with might not be so different. And of course, Punjab has its own tale of woes in terms of economic stagnation. But the question that the whole issue of the agricultural reforms and the transformation that they want to bring about, and perhaps to wean away farmers from the addiction to the minimum support price of paddy and wheat, is how do you prepare a society and how do you prepare politicians to accept short-term pain for long-term gain?
Oh, what a fantastic question, and such a difficult one, Ambassador Suri. I mean, eventually it boils down to what can we as an economy afford? Particularly when we are thinking of having a large unified market, where we do want to give individual farmers the right to have access to the entire Indian market. They can sell wherever they want. Now, I think, when you say, how do we prepare? Remember, state is also part of that calculation. States also gain when we have a certain framework in place. So when we think of reforms, and particularly the current agriculture reforms, and that is dismantling of the APMCs in particular, has come as it is an exogenous shock. But from an overall perspective of agriculture development in India, from the point of food security, from the point of long-term sustainable agricultural growth, it is important for us to consider these short-term pains, and particularly the one that Punjab is feeling. Punjab has gained a lot because of the state of Punjab, I think, has benefited from the existing apparatus, and it is just unsustainable from a long-term perspective. So the reforms which have finally come in, I think farmers do realize that while assured minimum returns, which were through the APMCs, have now been dismantled. Of course, now it is for the state also to respond, and Haryana has responded by lowering the APMC tax. So by making the government mandis also highly competitive, because now they have to compete with the private mandis. But you see, highly subsidized diesel, highly subsidized agriculture has also meant distortion of the land quality, decline of water table. It has led to a kind of distortion in farming itself, which for Punjab from a long-term perspective becomes very, very problematic. The fact that we are growing rice in Punjab is itself a cause of great concern because we don't get as much rainfall there. So I think, again, it's an issue about long-term gains for the society from the short-term weaning off of some of the existing policies.
Absolutely. I have a question for Dr. Rudra Chaudhary. With the likely change in leadership in the US, how is it going to impact India-Iran and India-Afghanistan relations, particularly in view of the Taliban assuming centrality in Afghanistan in the future power structures? Rudra, are you happy to take that? I think you're on mute. I think you're on mute, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Although I do think that the chairperson is perhaps better placed to answer this question than I am, but I'll kind of put in my 2 cents. I think in the case of Iran, I think the change will be quite dramatic. I don't think it will be incremental. If the Biden administration does come in, and shouldn't say it, but by all indications, it looks like that's the direction over today and tomorrow. I think there will be a new formulation of the JCPOA, which was the Democratic Obama administration effort by which a deal was to be struck with Iran on its nuclear weapons. That was completely unraveled by the Trump administration, and I am pretty convinced that a Biden administration and the key people that he has in his security portfolio will resurrect that. It won't be called the JCPOA. I think that will be politically difficult, but I think there will be an outreach to Iran which can only benefit India. I mean, India's had to hedge around sanctions We've had to figure out alternatives to supply of crude oil from Iran, and it's been costly to the relationship across the board. On Afghanistan, my sense is we'll get a little bit more certainty, but only certainty for a withdrawal that has already started. I mean, the only difference I think that between the two administrations, at least in my view, is number one, the remaining 7,000 or 8,000 troops will withdraw over a period of the next 1.5 years as the intra-Afghan dialogue commences and continues. Biden has made it very clear, and he's put it down on paper, that he will keep a force inside of Afghanistan for counter-terrorism missions, and I think that's a good thing for India as a whole. On the Taliban and the negotiations, my only fear is, and this is really nothing to do with the character of a democratic administration versus the character of a Republican one, is that at this stage, I think if you lose one of the key brokers of this multi-tiered set of dialogues around Afghanistan, so if you lose Zalmay Khalilzad, I don't think it will be easy to replace that persona, given the relationships that he's built up across the board, including in South Asia, and after perhaps a bit of a difficult start even with India.
Yeah, I think I would just add that a Biden administration, if you get one which is more thoughtful and less reflexive in its approach, both towards Iran and towards Afghanistan, is a positive for India. Certainly, it gets us the additional space that we need in our relationship with Iran. And if it takes a more sensible approach towards the withdrawals from Afghanistan, that again is something that we would see in our long-term interests. How they deal with the Taliban, whether they remain an active player, is something that we will see as we go along. But I have a second question, which is for Dr. Shamika Ravi. In your view, in the light of current developments, what is a more likely future scenario? Reformed multilateral institutions or the emergence of new multilateral structures? Which is the best option from India's perspective?
Well, I frankly think we should be part of reforming as much as creation of new the world order or the new multilateral institutions. But I think, Ambassador Suri, regardless of what we might want, eventually I think it is the limitation in terms of the state capacity that we grapple with as a country, whether it is in economic policy formulations, whether it is in managing external relations. I think the state capacity needs to be enhanced for us to realize the potential of being part of either the existing multilateral setup or actively, creating something new. But our experience with our trade negotiations have clearly shown that we need to enhance our own capacity to really have policy objectives which are better outlined. I think with empirical heft, we should know what our current situation is and have a clarity in terms of what our objective is for us to truly realize either of these two scenarios that you are outlining.
Rudra, you want to add anything to that?
I've got a similar view to institutions. Yeah, I've got a similar view to Shamika, but investing in new multilateral platforms is a very expensive affair. It's not something that can be achieved in a timeline. It's almost like norm building. You have to get an idea, you have to institutionalize that idea amongst within your country. B, as Shamika said, you have to have the economic capability, the political clout to be able to cascade that amongst various communities, whether it's in APAC, whether it's in Europe, etc. So I think India can get there, but the way to do it is first to reform existing multilateral. And we've got two great examples. India, as the Foreign Secretary said, will have a leading position in the UNSC come January. In 2022, we'll have a leading position in the G20.
That secretariat is already being invested right now. The key question for us is, what do we want to do through these two big institutions? I mean, this is as multilateral as it gets. At the UN, what is it exactly that we want to achieve? And at the G20, so, for years, we've been talking about creating some kind of a data link, leveraging India's data infrastructure, the fact that we are a large data market, which is why all these foreign companies are flocking to India. But what does that mean? So I think as much as economic capability, and to perhaps complement Shamika's point, I think clarity on what we want from the international, which will require us to ask some pretty hard questions of what can be achieved politically domestically. Right? So I'll give an example of data. You can't want multilateralism of data to be part of some kind of a G20 circuit for arbitrating data access and transfer issues, which is a 21st century phenomenon. I mean, this is the next 100 years of multilateralism. It's around data. Whilst at the same time pressing ahead with stark localization requirements, which now studies have shown have very little economic meaning. And that is the key tension point. So for me, the challenge is not only reforming multilateralism today, but first unpicking and tidying up the tensions that exist in our multilateral positions.
Yeah, and of course, meanwhile, with all of the frustration with the lack of reform in multilateral institutions, you are also beginning to see the emergence of minilaterals and plurilaterals and groups of like-minded countries and talks of a D10 of democracies, etc., etc. So all of these are also, I think, being thrown into the mix of international politics. There's a question again for Dr. Shamika from Ian Lynn in UK. McKinsey and Company estimate that gender inequality in India reduces the GDP by 12.5%. Although India is making progress in this area, it is not in line with holistic global advances. How do you see this being overcome?
Well, gender remains, I think, one of our most weakest link as far as a lot of the transformations that I spoke about in the presentation. We remain a peculiar growth story because we are the only country that has seen a decline in labor force participation of women with economic growth. Because whether it is boy preference, whether it is skewed sex ratio being driven by certain societal preferences, South Korea, China, and many other countries, including Japan, have struggled with this problem for many years. But they've been able to overcome through policy interventions, and they have only improved labor force participation of women from very low levels. But with economic growth, they have managed to raise that. We remain the only country which has seen a decline. So, it's a very good question because it's a fundamental structure of the Indian economy, which remains a huge cause of concern. But one, I think, where policy responses have been at a more macro level, which means whether it is instituting a policy where 30% board membership necessarily, mandatorily has to go to women, as far as the Companies Act is concerned, or mandating 30% all NREGA jobs for women. In fact, government sector remains the only sector where there is no wage disparity between men and women. But having a declining labor force participation, particularly when you're seeing a neighboring country like Bangladesh, which has seen remarkable growth in those sectors where women's labor force participation has improved, such as apparel, I think we have a long way to go. But a 6-month maternity leave, I think there are macro level policies that are getting initiated. But I think, Ambassador Suri, the problems for us are much more institutional. When you have fast urbanizing growth, when you have fast nuclearizing families, a society that values children and values families is now, the cost of rearing children is now disproportionately being borne only by women in the society. And I think on account of having such a large informal market, because we don't formalize a lot of these transactions, we will always undercount. And I think an example that I'd like Ian to consider is that imagine in India if one household, a lady from one house went and did babysitting in the adjacent household neighbors, and that particular house sent the the lady to work in this particular household, you would have transaction which is now formal, contracted, and financial. But because the contracts are now largely informal in India, where women are concerned, we are undercounting a lot of the economic impact of women's participation because of the informal nature of it. So I think when they say global transformations, we aren't keeping up, it's on account of the institutions that exist and the informality in the market. I think we are truly undercounting the women's participation.
Perhaps a final question for Dr. Rudra Chaudhary from Brigadier Samarth Nagar. You have stated that border management agreements with China, quote unquote, bought us time. If there was a level of clarity that we were buying time with respect to the potential power differential and its trajectory, could we have progressed differently rather than continue with or further invest in strategic autonomy, which apparently inhibited the utilization of the time we had bought, considering where we find ourselves today? How would you react if one were to say that your assertion is manufactured and self-serving? Did you get that, Rudra?
Sorry, my internet went off for a second. Could you just repeat the question, sir?
Okay, it's a longish one, so bear with me. It's from Brigadier Samarth Nagar. You have stated that the border management agreements with China, quote unquote, bought us time. If there was a level of clarity that we were buying time with respect to the potential power differential and its trajectory, could we have progressed differently rather than continue with or further invest in strategic autonomy, which apparently inhibited the utilization of the time we had bought, considering where we find ourselves today? How would you react if one were to say that your assertion is manufactured and self-serving?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this could well be tautological or self-serving, but I do believe that I think the way to do this would be, I think we need to get away from a binary. So right now what we've got ourselves is a binary, which is the architecture for Sino-Indian relations roughly between 1988 and 2013 or 2012 did not work, or it did work. I think what I'm trying to suggest is, is that there is clearly a middle ground over here. Is there was no option but to engage China, in my view, the way in which we did between 1988 and roughly the early 2000s. I do feel that one of the key arguments of the early 90s was to invest in the trade relationship. So right after the Peace and Tranquility Agreement of 1993, the confidence building measures of 1996, the period from 96 to 2005 was to figure out that trade agreement. 2005 was to put it down in an institutional architecture, the political parameters agreement, which allowed us to look beyond the border. So that was an actual agreement which said is that, look, let's not get hypnotized by the border in itself. Let's look beyond the border. And that's where we saw a trade relationship. I do feel that it was an unexpected consequence that the trade deficit was as wide and the delta was as big as it is today. That should have been corrected long before. And I think that is where the special representative relationship between the two sides could have perhaps been a lot more robust from roughly 2010 onwards. And for a variety of reasons, both domestically in India and inside of China, that did not happen. I am not certainly suggesting that it is only in 2020 that after the Galwan incident that we should revise our architecture. I think this could have been done perhaps in the early part of the 21st century, certainly around 2010 or 12. But by and large, I will stand by my argument that the basic architecture of the relationship did allow us to move beyond disagreement. Let's not forget that in 1988, that Rajiv Gandhi visit was based on many factors, but two primary factors as far as I see it. Number one was the closing of the Sino-Soviet relationship for the first time since roughly 1964. And second we had just confronted China on the border between 1986 and 1988. So that was the impetus for that beginning of that new architecture in itself. And I do think it's bought us time. The key question is, how is that time to be used? If the question seems to suggest that we should be moving more to, we should have done more to move towards an alliance form or some kind of an alignment, for instance, that's a political call. I do think that we lost a little bit of time in understanding China come 2012, but it wasn't just India. I think many parts of the world misunderstood what Xi Jinping's China was all about.
Yeah, and I think and that's a fair point, which I also wanted to supplement, that hindsight can be 20/20, and sometimes we take that view of what we know today to reflect on how we should have acted at a certain point of time in the past. And in fact, you very correctly quoted Kissinger on the pitfalls of real-time policy making, and the fact that what you do in real time is going to be subject to scrutiny at a later point of time. But yeah, we're not the only ones who are dealing with a very different China. And I think that, while we analyze and discuss how we should have acted, it is not with a constant China that we are looking at. It's also a China which has dramatically altered its behavior, and perhaps to its short-term advantage. But I think the jury is going to be out for a while on what it does to its longer-term growth aspirations of dominance in this region. So let me just try and end on that sobering note. It's been fascinating to hear Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla on India's quest for strategic autonomy, to have Dr. Rudra Chaudhary explore some of these facets along with Dr. Shamika Ravi. Over to you, Mr. Gandhi.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Suri. Phenomenal session here. The reality is that transformation must be across spectrum, urban, rural. Transformation has to happen both on the thinking level and on the implementation of ideas level. Just big thoughts are not enough. We must study through what's working and what's not working. I think we saw through the presentations what really we have to get down to the basics and begin figuring out our studies. Thank you very much again, all of you, for being on the panel. It brings us to the conclusion of our session 3 for our virtual webinar, India's National Security, the Decade Ahead. Session 4 will be held at 10 a.m. India time tomorrow. The title is India's Security Horizon, the Coming Decade. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this virtual webinar, and please tune in slightly before 10 a.m. tomorrow, and we look forward to your questions. Good night and good luck.